These are the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not of the strident clamor of the bad people, but of the appalling silence of the good people. Our generation will have to repent, not only for the words and acts of the children of darkness, but also for the fears and apathy of the children of light. These words, spoken by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., from a famous speech delivered in 1965. 50 years later, these words speak to our generation with just as much truth and relevance as they did then. Every day, we strive to live in a way which is right in the eyes of God. We try to live in ways that align us with what Dr. King called the children of light. We seek to live in ways that are good for our families, true to ourselves, upright within our communities. Yet, as Dr. King articulated so powerfully in 1965, when it comes to many of the social injustices of society, we all too often turn a blind eye, perhaps out of fear, discomfort, or misconception. Or perhaps we simply do not know what to do. But whatever the case may be, we frequently remain silent when we are confronted by injustice in the world. I recently asked my friend, Reverend Joel Goza, who will be speaking with us this afternoon immediately following this sermon, what, if anything, can inspire a community to fight for the rights of those who are suffering from injustice, oppression, and extreme inequality? His answer to me is really at the core of my sermon today, and that is that it is extremely difficult, he said, to battle something as overwhelming as the ills of society without establishing a personal connection to the issues at hand. Empathy and compassion need a face. The human heart is more easily moved when we can place ourselves within the predicaments of those who suffer. Last month, the tragic plight of the refugees fleeing from Syria received such a face, as a photograph of a dead toddler washed up on the shores of a Turkish beach went viral. It was viewed by millions of people around the world and rapidly became a visual catalyst in drawing the attention of the American news media to a humanitarian crisis which has been consuming Europe for over a year. The photograph was of a 3-year-old boy by the name of Elan Kurdi, who died with his younger brother and his mother as they were trying to flee from Syria through Greece. The photograph put a face and a name to a crisis which is being called Europe's worst humanitarian disaster since World War II. And yet, even as this horrible story reaches our shores, our responses have been shockingly anemic as a nation and surprisingly offensive by many who I've spoken to in the Jewish community. While this refugee crisis is indeed complex and extremely difficult to comprehend, it is also very simple in terms of our ability to relate to it. Just as it was during World War II, when righteous Gentiles took risk to save Jewish lives from certain death in Europe, so too it is for us today. And the photograph of this dead little boy on the shores of a beach in Turkey not only reminds us that this is a human crisis, but this is our story transferred to a new population. As Jews, we cannot ignore the fact that the plight of these people from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, echoes our long history as a people seeking refuge on foreign soil. Our collective memory of oppression and exile should be enough to create a mindset of empathy and compassion for all who are seeking safety and security for themselves and for their families. On this holy and awesome day set aside for self-awareness, on this day that we feel the pains of hunger, on this day that our community of Israel sets aside for rectification and for atonement, we have a sacred obligation to raise our awareness of the ills of society and the world at large. But how? How can this day possibly impact our abilities to address a crisis as politically complex and numerically overwhelming as 4 million displaced human beings fleeing for their lives? How can this Day of Atonement begin to move us toward addressing endemic societal injustices like hunger, homelessness, and poverty? Part of the answer lies within the wisdom that was shared by my friend Reverend Goza, who contends that until we are able to place ourselves within the stories with those who suffer, our abilities to respond will be marginal. This is also the wisdom that is central to the rituals and to the liturgy of Yom Kippur itself. As we fast, we feel the pains of hunger, and we can more readily comprehend the pains of those who go hungry every day. As we pray, we strive for atonement and seek a spiritual connection to God's goodness, mercy, and compassion. This day helps us to remember that each of us plays a vital role in the redemption of the world. Central to our scriptural readings throughout the day are ethical obligations and moral imperatives, which calls us to remain steadfast in our efforts to make this world a better place. The Torah portion that we will be reading from this afternoon represents the centerpiece of these moral imperatives. The portion is from the book of Leviticus. It is referred to as the Holiness Codes and presents us with basic human codes of conduct. It begins with an eternal reminder that the human obligation to be holy is rooted in the fact that we are partners with God in the stewardship of all existence. It reads, Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohecha. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. It then continues with a series of ethical commandments on how we should act in holy ways in the world. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the corners of your field, and do not glean from the fallen ears of your crop. Nor may you strip your vineyard bare, nor gather the overlooked grapes. You must leave them for the poor and the stranger. You must not steal. You must not be deceitful. You must not lie to one another. You must not oppress your neighbor. Do not commit robbery. The wages of the laborer shall not remain with you overnight. Do not curse the deaf. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Do not pervert justice, neither by way of favoring the poor or deferring to the powerful. Judge your neighbor justly. Do not hate your brother or your sister in your heart. When strangers sojourn with you in your land, you shall not oppress them. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. These are but a few of the laws that comprise the commandments at the heart of this ethical code. We read them each year on Yom Kippur to remind ourselves that we have an ongoing sacred responsibility to pursue justice and equality in everything we do. But our Yom Kippur messages about moral responsibility do not stop with a list. For immediately following our reading of the holiness codes, we read the entire book of Jonah. As you may recall, Jonah is the prophet who tries to run from his responsibilities. Jonah's efforts to flee lead him from one personal crisis to the next, from the bowels of a ship to the belly of a whale, from one crisis to the next, until Jonah finally comes to understand that we cannot and must not try to hide or run or flee from our moral responsibilities, especially when it comes to the destiny of others. But perhaps the most powerful scriptural teaching of this day comes from the prophet Isaiah. In the passage we just heard just moments ago, Isaiah challenges us to consider the meaning of the rituals we perform. Is this the fast I desire, cries Isaiah, a day of self-affliction, bowing your head like a reed and covering yourself with sackcloth and ashes? Is this what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the eternal your God? No. This is the fast I desire, to unlock the shackles of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke of tyranny, to let the oppressed go free, to break every chain asunder. It is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, clothe them, never withdrawing yourselves from your kin. Here Isaiah draws our attention to the hypocrisy of a people who are sacrificing animals to God while neglecting to see ways to make personal sacrifices for the betterment of the world. Isaiah speaks to us today. For how can we allow ourselves to feel the discomforts of fasting without developing a sense of empathy for people who are starving in the streets every day? Indeed, this day calls us to righteousness. This day hearkens us to the needs of the poor and the hungry. This day calls us to make a shift in the ways that we see and understand our responsibilities to society at large. This day implores us to open our eyes and our ears a little wider, to open our hearts to institutionalized barriers that stand in the way of social and economic mobility of the poorest members of our community, our country, and our world. We know that here in the city of Houston today, there are those that go to sleep every night hungry. In fact, 1 in 5 children live in poverty. This rate is even higher among Black and Hispanic communities and those who live in single-parent homes. We know that children who attend schools in the poorest communities are less likely to remain in school and graduate. We know this. We know that this education gap contributes significantly to the stagnation of economic and social mobility. We know this. We know that boys growing up in poverty are more likely to be arrested as adults, and their female peers are more likely to give birth out of wedlock. We know this. Most of us are aware in some way or another with these statistics. But when it comes time to finding ways to improve public education or addressing some of the festering issues that act like a cancer in the poorest pockets of American society, we tend to be silent. Not because we don't care. I would imagine that every single person in this sanctuary cares deeply about these issues. But most of us don't know where to begin or what to do. With some issues, like providing clothing for the needy, it is easy to understand what is required of us, and it takes little from us to respond. It is easy to empty our closets and know that there are people out there who will willingly receive them and really benefit from them. And that feels good. But how do we begin to comprehend our role in the plight of 4 million refugees seeking safety around the world? Where do we begin to find ways to reduce the fact that 1 in 5 children living in the United States lives in poverty? One starting point is the human imagination. While it may be difficult to comprehend our role in the plight of 4 million people fleeing for their lives, it is not difficult to imagine that photograph of the dead little boy on that Turkish beach being one of our own relatives in the 1930s fleeing Europe. It is not difficult to imagine that we could have been jumping on ships and trying to find asylum somewhere. Where would we be today if our grandparents and great-grandparents had been turned away as they sought asylum? Sadly, few of us would even exist. And this is exactly what we need to consider as we imagine what the future might hold for the millions of people seeking asylum today. And what of poverty? Here, too, our abilities to imagine can help us. While we may not be able to comprehend the injustices that come with extreme poverty in the United States, we do know how hungry we are feeling at this very moment, and we know that our fast as it goes through the day will become increasingly painful. We know in our voluntary fast what this feels like, and this can help us. Yet our fast is, as Isaiah reminds us, a fast of complete folly if it does not compel us to act. Our fast throughout the day must be a catalyst in helping us imagine what it must feel like for those who cannot afford to eat every day. Imagine trying to live on $5 or less a day. Imagine how much food one could buy for $35 a week for a family of 4, 5, 6, or more in a neighborhood that doesn't even have a grocery store. Imagine not having enough money to pay for simple necessities like socks and underwear, and sending your child to school every day with that same set. We sit here in this beautiful, comfortable sanctuary. We look nice. We smell nice. We feel nice. But while we are here praying and fasting, there are millions who are suffering from inequalities and injustices that are seemingly unimaginable. Yet this holy and awesome day calls upon us to try to imagine. Yom Kippur invites us to consider the injustices of our day through the lens of ethical responsibility. It implores us to refrain from the temptation to flee. Yom Kippur provides us with rituals that to help us develop a sense of empathy and words to combat moral silence. On this Yom Kippur in particular, we will hearken to the call of Isaiah and seek ways to respond to the plight of the stranger and the downtrodden in our society. During our Yom Kippur discussion hour, which follows this sermon, we will be welcoming to our pulpit the Reverend Harvey Clemens Jr. and the Reverend Joel Goza and their music minister from Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in the 5th Ward. Together with discussion and gospel music, we will try to gain an awareness of some of the challenges which faces one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city of Houston. And we will try to explore some of the ways that we might translate the mission of this Day of Atonement into action in our city. It is my hope that our time together will be the first of many efforts to work together and address some of the city's greatest challenges regarding education, hunger, and poverty. It is also my hope that today will be a prelude to a year of action for our congregation. So I invite anyone to be a part of a movement here to make a difference. I'll be sending out information later in this week to try to gain a team of people to respond to needs and build a community of action. We may not be able to solve every issue, but we cannot refrain from trying. We cannot remain silent like the bystanders who stood on the sidelines during World War II. We cannot remain silent like those who refused to speak out against the injustices taking place in the 1950s and 60s and here in the United States. 50 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. challenged the children of light to find their voices amidst the appalling silence of his day. He, like the prophet Isaiah, and like the holiness codes we will be reading from this afternoon, implore us, all people of goodness, all people of mercy, all people who care about the world and society at large, that we should remain steadfast in our pursuit of justice, truth, and righteousness for all people, all over the world. Let us endeavor to live in accordance with the promises that this day demands. And as we begin this year anew, may our efforts enable us to help ease the pains of a struggling world. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be so.